It's my pleasure to introduce and welcome back to St. John's College Professor Sayyad Nizamuddin Ahmad, who is currently the Prophet Muhammad University Professor of Shia Islam Studies at Florida International University. He is an honorary research fellow in the Institute of Arabic and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. He also serves on the faculty of Mufid Academic Seminary in Fairfax, Virginia. He received his master's and doctorate in Islamic Studies from Princeton University. He also holds an MA in Arabic from Indiana University and a Bachelor of Science in Pure Mathematics from Purdue University. He is taught at the University of Texas at Austin, the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization in Kuala Lumpur, the American University of Sharjah, and the American University in Cairo. And he's published extensive commentaries and translations. He is also, maybe most importantly, the proud parent of two Johnnies and a good friend of the college. He lectured here last year on the regality of wisdom, the philosopher king between Athens and Isfahan. He's offered seminars for our faculty on Mulla Sadra and on Ibn al-Arabi's Bezels of Wisdom. And more generally, he's been an important colleague and friend and interlocutor as we continue to contemplate ways to expand the study of Middle Eastern classics broadly at St. John's College. So we're very, very grateful for all of that work and very grateful to have you back for your lecture today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ahmad, whose lecture today is entitled Time, Eternity, and the Tyranny of History in Islamic Philosophy. Welcome.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, I really must extend my thanks to my dear friend and colleague, Dean J. Walter Sterling, as well as his team, Paul Cooley and Amanda Romero, for doing everything necessary to make this event possible. This is an extremely difficult topic, and most people here will not be acquainted with it. So what I'm going to present is I'm going to try and just introduce this question, the question of time and eternity, the question of creation out of nothing, as a philosophical and theological problem specifically in the history of Islamic philosophy. And I hope that that might generate some interest in anybody or all here in pursuing the study of Islamic philosophy further. Unlike last year, I don't know if I'll be walking around as much because this is so complicated. There are arguments and things, so I do have a prepared and written document which I will be mainly reading from. All right. So with that said, the notions of time and eternity, with reference to the context of the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, or creation out of nothing, give rise to a host of problems and paradoxes which have been the focus of vigorous debate and raging controversy in the history of philosophy and theology. In the case of Islamic civilization, the classic example of this debate in Islam is the famous exchange between Ibn Rushd, known to the West by his Latinized name Averroes, who died in the year 595 of the Hijrah. In case you're wondering, it's 1444 of the Hijrah right now, and that corresponds to 1198 of the Common Era, and al-Ghazālī. These two figures. Al-Ghazālī died 505 or 1111. 1111 Gregorian calendar. We joke that that's the easiest date to remember in Islamic history, easiest death date. So al-Ghazālī is very famous for having penned a spirited attack against philosophy entitled Tahafut al-Falasifa. Now, Tahafut al-Falasifa in Arabic can be translated more than one way into English. It means usually it's translated as the refutation of philosophy, sometimes the auto-destruction or the self-refutation of philosophy. And the reason that title is that way, it's because the verb from which it derives, tahafut, that word involves mutual sort of interaction. And he wrote that book with that title, or he gave it that title because he tried to show that philosophy collapses on the weight of its own contradictions. And when he said philosophy, He specifically had in mind the works of al-Farabi, but more so those of Ibn Sina, who is known as Avicenna by his Latin name. So in this treatise, the question of whether the universe is created in time, created out of nothing, that has a beginning in time, takes up most of the space. Now, the work was, of course, meticulously refuted in the following generation, point by point, by Averroes in his book, Tahafut at-Tahafut, or the self-refutation of the self-refutation. They were really good with these witty titles back in those days. So this debate is extremely well known even among Western students of philosophy and is often taken as being definitive in the alleged death and decline of philosophy in the Islamic world. However, this is a grave error. While it might be true that Ibn Rushd's work did not succeed in gaining a wide audience of readers who would transmit and study his work in the Islamic world, philosophy certainly did not die out. In Sunni circles, philosophical thought continued to be cultivated in some form or another, although it never became a central concern. In contrast, the Shi'i world, the world of Shia Islam, has been for the most part far more receptive to philosophical inquiry, and it was in Shi'i circles that a most unique solution to the problems of time and eternity emerged in the work of someone known to posterity as Mīr Dāmād. Now, Mir Damad lived in the Safavid period, Safavid Iran, so that's the 1600s. That's when he flourished. And his work and his legacy has been eclipsed by that of his much more famous student and disciple, Mullah Sadra. But I think that Mīr Dāmād is quite interesting, even though he has been rather neglected. And that is one of the reasons I want to devote this topic, or the topic of this lecture, to his contribution. But of course, we have to first start with this question at a more basic level. So what is the central question? The central question is this: does the universe have a beginning in time, or is it eternal? Think about that. This is an ancient question, and it was addressed in some form or another by the ancient sages of Hellas, such as Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, and Proclus, to mention the most prominent luminaries in the firmament of ancient Greek wisdom. However, in this brief lecture, we will barely be able to do justice to the Muslim heirs of this debate, and thus must leave a more comprehensive account for another occasion. For theists, especially those of the Jewish and Christian religions, who both share a belief in some version of what is held to be a revealed scripture, known to both as the Bible, as well as for Muslims who profess belief in their own revealed scripture, namely the Quran, all three are committed to some kind of doctrine of a creator God. And it's this creator God who somehow brings the universe into being. The vast majority of these believers hold that this bringing into being of the cosmos was an act of creation out of nothing. Creatio ex nihilo. So on such a view, the universe is originated in time. It has a temporal origin, which is to say that at some point in time, the universe did not exist, and then at some point in time, God created it, and lo and behold, here we are. For Muslim philosophers and theologians, as well as for Jews and Christians, but from here on out, I'm really only going to talk about Muslim philosophers and theologians, this reduces to the question of temporal, or the temporal status of the universe or cosmos. In Arabic, the word is alam. It's cognate to the Hebrew olam. But alam, technically, as a technical term in Islamic philosophy, means everything other than God. So it's the question of the status of the universe or cosmos, the temporal status of the universe or cosmos. Namely, whether the cosmos is hadith, the Arabic term meaning originated, and which most Muslim theologians understood to mean originated in time, or temporally originated. Or whether the cosmos is qadim, That Arabic word means eternal. This thorny problem is known in Islamic philosophy as mas'alat al-huduth wal-qidam, or the problem of the eternity or temporal origination of the cosmos. Now, this question may also be thought of in another way. It may be thought of as a question about the nature of the God-world relationship. What is the relation, if any, between God and the cosmos? And that has to be seen in the light of, in Islamic theology and philosophy, God is seen as necessary and the universe is contingent. So what is the relationship between necessary being and contingent being? It's important to understand that the formulation of the problem in these terms is due to a Sunni school of theology known as the Ash'ari school. And it was to that school of theology that al-Ghazālī adhered. And in fact, Ibn Sina never presented a thesis. Remember, Ibn Sina is the main person that al-Ghazālī is attacking. And Ibn Sina never presented a thesis in which he claimed explicitly that the world was qadim or eternal in the way that al-Ghazālī presents him. So in that book, al-Ghazālī often constructs a straw man and then attacks it. What Ibn Sina did argue for was that the Ash'ari notion of a world originated in time leads to a number of logical contradictions, and it is the very problems that arise in this connection that al-Ghazālī tries to address in his work. And it is those to which Ibn Rushd responds, or Averroes responds in his refutation of al-Ghazālī. I'm going to try to put this here now. Okay. So Ibn Rushd's method, can you all hear me? Ibn Rushd's method is to weigh every statement in al-Ghazālī's book, whether made by al-Ghazālī or attributed to al-Ghazālī by Ibn Sina, according to the single criterion of Aristotelian logic. So he informs the reader of this in the single sentence introduction which he opens the book. He says, it is the aim of this work to make clear the relative merit of the statements occurring in the Tahafut of Abu Hamid. Abu Hamid is how al-Ghazālī was known, in terms of their veracity and persuasive force, and that in fact most of them fall short of being demonstrative proofs. They're not apodictic proofs, and thus do not give rise to certainty and true knowledge. So Ibn Rushd is assuming an acquaintance with the different kinds of arguments in Aristotelian logic. And they are demonstrative proof, or in Arabic burhan, dialectic argument or dialectical proof, or jadal, and sophistry, and then you have rhetorical arguments. So he says that the arguments of al-Ghazālī are in the highest degree dialectical. They don't rise up to the level of being apodictic proof or proper logical demonstrations. So as an illustration of Ibn Rushd's method, I'm just going to look briefly at the first proof of the philosophers, in other words, al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, for the eternity of the world as presented by al-Ghazālī. The first proof is presented rather simplistically, I think, by al-Ghazālī. He simply tells us that it is the philosopher's contention that it is absolutely impossible for the temporal to proceed from the eternal. In other words, only the eternal can proceed from the eternal. If it is accepted that Allah, the Arabic word for God, is eternal, and if it is inconceivable for the temporal to emerge from the eternal, then Allah could not have created the cosmos at a particular time. Yet, the cosmos clearly does exist. It therefore follows that the world is eternal. Of course, Ibn Sina does not really say things in this way. He means to say that among the logical contradictions that the Ash'ari notion of creation out of nothing inexorably gives rise to is that since, according to their view, God is both eternal and prior to the world in time, temporally prior, this leads to the notion that he existed for some indeterminate period without the cosmos also existing. Moreover, The latter also implies that the existence of the cosmos is in this condition of, shall we say, latency, is a mere possibility awaiting emergence into actuality. Whenever this emergence into actuality does transpire, then there must have been some change or preponderating factor to have brought about this passage, so to speak, from potency or latency or possibility to actuality. If no such change occurred or no such factor was present, then no cosmos would result. If there was some such change or preponderating factor, then not only does the question arise as to why it occurred at a particular time and not before or after, but also how change is possible in God. Since the first part of the latter question can be asked regarding every proposed time, for the creation of the universe, it leads to an infinite regress, regressio ad infinitum, which is deemed impossible by the philosophers, and so this argument is taken to support the view that the world is not originated in time, but rather is eternal. Al-Ghazālī is simply pleading the case for what we might call the common sense view of the God-world relationship, which is adhered to by most believers in the three religions of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, namely that God simply existed all by himself for an indeterminate, abstract duration. Then he decided to create the cosmos, which he did by bringing it forth out of pure nothingness. And so here it is, and here we are. At some point, unknown to anyone except God, but certain to happen sooner or later, the whole process will be reversed, and he will destroy the entire cosmos. Al-Ghazālī sees no problem with an eternal will bringing into existence a temporal universe at a particular time. Averroes finds both the argument of Al-Ghazālī and Ibn Sina, as presented by Al-Ghazālī, to fall short of the rigorous demands of demonstrative proof, and regards these arguments as being in the highest degree dialectical. في أعلى مراتب الجدل in Arabic. You have to remember, Averroes is a pure Aristotelian. He states that these arguments are based merely on commonly held notions, namely the notions of possibility, of time, of will, of change, of the notion of the temporal, of the eternal, etc. And that such notions are ambiguous and equivocal, whereas terms and premises employed in demonstrative proof must be free of such ambiguity and apply to things belonging to the same kind. Will, time, possibility, and so on do not apply to God in the same way. At best, they are analogical. And they apply to human beings, so they don't apply in the same way to God as they apply to human beings, and thus premises and arguments built on such notions cannot lead to certainty. In fact, they cannot but lead to erroneous results. You have to understand that in logic, you must define your terms. Terms must be clear and unambiguous. Propositions can only be true or false. Arguments are not true or false. Arguments are either valid or invalid. And so if from, or ab initio, from the very beginning, if your terms are ambiguous, this is a huge problem, logically speaking. So Ibn Rushd emphasizes this radical disconnection, or I would say disanalogy, between man and God, particularly between the eternal will of God and the will of man, which is conditioned and constrained by so many factors. Ibn Rushd also argues that Al-Ghazālī and the Ash'arites also need to explain why God created the world at a particular instant. If we assume time to apply in some sense to God, which is what these guys really think, that's what they indicate in speaking this way. So if we assume, if we accept that, for the sake of argument, Ibn Rushd would say, then it would appear that Al-Ghazālī and the Ash'arites have a real problem. And that's because they have to answer the question why God chose to create the universe or the cosmos at some particular time, call it T subscript 0 or T naught, as the British like to say, rather than some other instance, T1 or T2 or some T subscript I. This is a crucial point because for God, all instants, every single one, T0 or T0, T1, T2, T3, Ti, Tn, etc., dot, all instants are the same. If we attempt to dispose of this thorny objection by arguing that time does not apply to God, but rather comes into existence with the cosmos and is a phenomenon which is ultimately an effect of the relative motion of various celestial bodies in it, even then this objection still stands in some form. The reason for this is because God still has to choose to create the cosmos. And for him, all choices must be the same. One may simply repeat the objection verbatim, simply replacing the words time and instant with the notion of choice, as opposed to T0, T1, etc. You just have C0, C1, etc. Because for God, all times, all choices are the same. So why must we speak of the cosmos being originated in time? Now, al-Ghazālī anticipated this question. And he gives the example of a hungry person faced with the choice of eating one and only one of two essentially equal and identical dates. All right? Given these two equivalent alternative courses of satisfying his hunger, they obviously are quite capable of choosing one over the other. God can do exactly the same thing, al-Ghazālī argues. Any rejection of this proposition, he further argues, is simply a failure of the human imagination, rather than a genuine philosophical objection to creatio ex nihilo. Ibn Rushd's response is that the example of the two dates is really far from accurate. Since given the choice between two similar alternatives, the choice of the hungry man is really a choice between accepting only one or rejecting both. In other words, of eating or not eating, inasmuch as either date will satisfy the person's hunger. In choosing a date, the person is simply choosing not to remain hungry. So there are really two different and opposite choices: to eat or not to eat. Two different and opposite choices rather than two identical choices, to eat this one or to eat that one. Therefore, the argument, Ibn Rushd says, cannot be used to establish that God can arbitrarily choose to create the world at a particular time. Furthermore, this argument cannot be made to suggest that the divine will can establish a difference where none actually exists. Ibn Rushd continually stresses the complete disanalogy between the divine will and the human will, just as there is a complete disanalogy between divine knowledge and human knowledge. According to Ibn Rushd, and as held by Aristotle, to whose teachings he was very, very, very loyal, the entire cosmos is in motion, and God is the unmoved mover. Ibn Sina also argued that God is the ultimate first cause behind all things. If this is so, asks al-Ghazālī, is it not a contradiction to deny that God brings the world into existence at a particular time? So you have to understand the debate between these guys. You know, al-Ghazālī, Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina, they all acknowledge that God is the creator. It's really a debate about what does this creative act mean, and how does it relate to time. So, continuing with al-Ghazālī's argument, why can't God create the universe at a particular time? After all, he would say, if everything in the universe, whether it is in motion or not, has cause or is caused, and we can in principle follow the links between things and their causes, and the causes of these causes, and so on, until we come to the first and original cause, namely God, then does this not establish that the universe is originated, indeed, temporally originated, created in time? Ibn Rushd has a very, very clever response to this objection. He says that the temporal proceeds from the first eternal, namely God, not insofar as it is temporal, but insofar as it is eternal, through being eternal generically, though temporal in parts. صدور الحادث عن القديم لا بما هو حادث بل بما هو أزلي من جهة أنه أزلي بالجنس حادث بالأجزاء. That's the Arabic expression. He means to say that we should not think in terms of an eternal being like God directly causing a non-eternal and temporal event. Temporal events have accidental causes which have their place in an exceedingly complex series and network of other temporal events. Yet the entire series or network of such temporal events as a whole, or in aggregate, is nonetheless itself eternal and brought about essentially by an eternal being acting on the totality. God is the essential cause of this aggregate, and he brings about its effects at the same time as it exists, which is not normally the case with accidental causal production. The eternal cause, namely God, is only indirectly the cause of temporal events themselves. God is directly the cause of the whole network of temporal events. So by this clever distinction, Ibn Rushd is able to claim that God does not directly act in time, yet remains the first cause, the unmoved mover, which is the terminal point of any series or network of temporal events. So this is an example of how one dimension of the debate played out in the pages of The Incoherence of the Incoherent. Is a large book. If you're interested, the whole thing is translated into English. It's even on sale here in the St. John's bookstore. So this is one kind of understanding, namely that of Ibn Rushd. And the problem remained a problem. And it was debated. But what took place in the Shia world, where philosophy really finds a home and a very receptive environment, for the most part, the question in some ways was put aside in the sense that the philosophy of Avicenna, of Ibn Sina, due to the efforts of someone who comes much later, namely Nasiruddin al-Tusi, he comes about 200-300 years later. And he was he was a polymath, he was a theologian, he was a philosopher, he's a commentator on Avicenna, he was an astronomer. His tables and his observational tables, his mathematical works are extremely, extremely important. He had a redaction of Euclid, he had a redaction of Ptolemy. These are important texts in the St. John's curriculum. He also really formulated trigonometry as we know it today. He wrote the first sort of standalone treatise on trigonometry, for the first time presenting it separate from astronomy. And he has tremendous contributions to Twelver Shiite theology, and for a time he also flirted with another kind of Shiism called Ismaili Shiism. So his writings are extremely significant. And he wrote a very important theological treatise known as the Tajrid al-I'tiqad in Arabic, or the Abstracta Theologica, of which I have produced a translation but has not yet been published. And in the first half, or the majority of that book is devoted to metaphysical questions. And there he presents the philosophy of Avicenna. And so many people in the Shia world who were theologians, who were involved and who accepted these notions, they had a Avicennian understanding of the God-world relationship. But yet there were people who didn't like this, and it was always a kind of thing that made people uncomfortable. And so Mīr Dāmād, who comes much later, long after al-Tusi, Nasiruddin al-Tusi dies in the year 672, and Mīr Dāmād's death date, I forget at the moment, it's 1040, 1050, something like that, I think, in the Hijra calendar. But again, it's the 1600s. So he comes much later. And he was a very, very devoted student of Avicenna. A very devoted student and commentator. Now, he was quite accomplished himself. He's an extremely prolific person. But his book on the question of time is his only complete work. He wrote many other treatises, but they're incomplete. He was so highly regarded in philosophy that he's called al-Mu'allim al-Thalith, the third teacher. So, Aristotle is the first teacher, of course. Avicenna is the second. And in his writings, he often refers to Ibn Sina as my compatriot in the pursuit of wisdom. So Mir Dāmād presents a highly original resolution to this problem. And it is to that resolution which I would now like to turn. His theory may be called the theory of meta-temporal origination, or the theory of perpetual origination. I will clarify these in due course. And he presented all of this in a very important book called al-Ghazālī, which I have here. al-Ghazālī. So it's a big book. And it's a very important book, and it's a very difficult book. Mīr Dāmād is known for his extremely, extremely difficult writing style. And he did this by design. Now, there is in this college a great devotion to the notion of esoteric writing, set out in a work known as Persecution and the Art of Writing. And it's true that Mīr Dāmād kind of joked with his disciple Mullah Sadra, because Mullah Sadra wrote him once saying, I've gotten myself into a lot of trouble, because Mullah Sadra espoused a kind of philosophical version of the doctrine of the unity of being, which was really goes back to someone named Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, and is seen by some people to compromise the God-world relationship and to lead to a kind of pantheism, which is not true. But as a result of that, he got himself in some trouble. And so Mīr Dāmād told him, well, the reason you did this, you got into this predicament, is because your Arabic is too clear. And I can testify he's a beautiful writer. It may also interest you to know that Ibn Rushd is a very clear writer of Arabic, as is al-Ghazālī. So Mīr Dāmād, yes, he's writing in a very obscure style, but he didn't need to. You have to understand he was very close to the Shah. And many of these philosophers in the history of Islam were grand viziers. They had very good positions. Some of them did get in trouble, but for the most part, their writing is extremely clear. So the idea of esoteric writing doesn't necessarily work. It might work with Maimonides, but I don't think it works here. And there's another important point to remember. In the Islamic world, there is a huge premium, especially in the pre-modern period, placed on eloquence and mastery of language. And Arabic is a very, very rich language and lends itself, even, it will surprise you maybe, in philosophical writing, to literary and rhetorical flourishes, to fascinating etymologies, and even to be writing in rhymed prose. And Mīr Dāmād is a master of this. And sometimes he will just use two words to say one thing that are very close in meaning because they derive from they have a similar morphological form, or they complete a rhyme in rhymed prose. Because in Arabic you can have rhymed prose. Poetry has to have meter and rhyme, unlike in English now, right? So he's really just kind of showing off when he writes that way. And that just makes it all the more difficult because the questions of being and time are, to state the obvious, highly recondite. So what is he trying to do in this book, the Kitab al-Qabasat, which means the title means the book of glimmering embers. So Qabasat is the plural of the Arabic word qabas. And I say this many times, if you want to understand Islamic civilization well, you have to have an acquaintance with the Quran in the original Arabic. So if you know that from the title, you'll immediately recognize that this is an allusion to a surah or chapter in the Quran, which is the surah of Taha. That's the title. I think it's the 20th surah. Muslims don't go by the number. It's like very similar to the Jews. We go by the name of the chapter or the section. And in that, Moses says to his family, Inni anastu naran, I perceive from afar a flame or a fire. Let me go to it and come back to you with a glimmering ember. So it's an allusion to that. So he's also implying that he has attained to this wisdom, of course, through his mastery of Avicenna and philosophical works, but there's another dimension as well. That's the implication anyway. He doesn't explicitly say that anywhere. But philosophers like Mīr Dāmād in the Islamic world always had some sort of spiritual practice as well, some form of ascesis. So it is important to understand that philosophers like Ibn Sina never claimed that God did not create or originate the universe. For philosophers like Ibn Sina, God did originate the universe, but God is not temporally prior. Rather, he is logically prior to the universe. In his proof for the existence of God, Ibn Sina relies on his crucial notions of necessity, wujub, and contingency, imkan, to establish the existence of the necessary being. In its most concise form, the wording is of Nasiruddin al-Tusi, it may be stated as follows. Given an existing thing, if it is necessary, wajib, then that is what was to be demonstrated, QED, we're done. And if it is not, namely if it is contingent, then his, capital H, existence is by that very fact entailed due to the impossibility both of a regressio ad infinitum as well as a vicious circle. So again, that's the wording of Nasiruddin al-Tusi in his Abstracta Theologica. And Ibn Sina sets that out in more detail in other works such as the Shifa, the Cure, and the Remarks and Admonitions, al-Isharat wa Tanbihat. So Ibn Sina is in no doubt that the cosmos is originated, that it is in Arabic hadith. But again, in logic it hinges on how you interpret the terms. So you'll say, yes, the universe is hadith, but it is not a huduth zamani. In other words, the universe is originated, but it is not a temporal origination. And due to the impossibility of a temporal gap between God and the product of his creative act, God's priority to the cosmos is a logical and non-temporal one. Since God as efficient cause is existent ab eterno, the cosmos as effect must also be existent ab eterno. God and world are then co-eternal. Thus, the universe is only logically preceded by an essential non-existence, what is called in Arabic adamun dhati, which is seen to be purely notional. It is in this sense that the universe is not hadith, that is to say, not originated in time. However, this is not to say that there is no gulf or discrepancy or qualitative difference between the two, between God and the cosmos, for there is no common measure between the ontological rank of necessity and the ontological rank, or rutba in Arabic, of contingency. Perhaps by now, the perceptive listener may have realized that the various terms used to express concepts of temporality and tense, such as time and eternity, deserve much more minute scrutiny. If we are to have any hope of better understanding the problem and arriving at a solution, we must examine these terms much more closely. And it is precisely this that Mīr Dāmād set out to do. Now, did he succeed in solving the problem? I'll leave you to ponder that at the conclusion of the lecture. Mīr Dāmād leaves no doubt as to what he intends to achieve in writing his massive work, the Book of the Glimmering Embers. He tells us in the opening lines, and I'm paraphrasing here, not translating directly, he tells us that he will establish by formal demonstration that it is God alone who is characterized by eternity, qidam in Arabic, and that the cosmos in its entirety is preceded by a real non-existence, adamun sarih, rather than the merely notional non-existence, adamun dhati, of Ibn Sina. And furthermore, that it is characterized as being originated and is inherently subject to destruction. He does this by introducing a threefold division of temporality that also signifies three distinct ontological dimensions as well as three different types of temporal relations. Now, Mīr Dāmād does this at length in the first chapter of the Book of Gleaming Embers through a very close reading of a number of passages taken across the oeuvre, the writings, the works of Ibn Sina, as well as some other thinkers, but mainly Ibn Sina. So he is very much an Avicennan, but he is extracting from ideas that were first formulated, I would say in broad strokes, by Ibn Sina, and using them in a new way. So he's kind of a reformulator, I would say, of the Avicennan tradition. And it's interesting, I think, that he did not do this in the form of a commentary, because in the Islamic world, people often wrote commentaries, and even if they had their own views to put forward, they would put them or embed them within a commentary. He did not do that with the Kitab al-Qabasat, the book of glimmering embers. But it's interesting that his son-in-law, Sayyad Ahmad al-Alawi, devoted a commentary to the book of glimmering embers. And we're fortunate that he did, let me tell you. So I'm just going to take one example of a quotation from Ibn Sina, which is really important for understanding this, and which is cited by Mīr Dāmād in the book of Glimmering Embers. This is from a work of Ibn Sina's called the Ta'liqat, or the Marginalia. This is a fascinating work because in that he answers inquiries and just says what he really thinks very openly. And it's also interesting because he talks about some of his contemporaries and he disparages them in no uncertain terms. So it makes for very entertaining reading as well. It's not just dry philosophy. So as I said, it's extremely important in logic to define your terms. Logic is the study of thought. And so we really have to examine our concepts. And this is sort of the point of departure for Ibn Sina's remarks here in the Ta'liqat, or the Marginalia, on the nature of human conceptions of temporality and tense. Ibn Sina says, quoting from the Marginalia, this is my own translation. I actually did it last night. The intellect grasps three kinds of entities. First, the first is in time and is characterized by the expression when, quote unquote when, which describes mutable things that have a beginning and an end, although their beginning is not their end, but their beginning entails that they have an end. Such an entity is in constant flux, one state passing away, followed by another. And this is what Ibn Sina below in the next example refers to as zaman, which is just a generic Arabic word for time. The second kind of entity is with time and is characterized by the designation of perpetuity. This is the Arabic word dahr, D-A-H-R. And dahr encompasses, you could say, or encloses or surrounds mere time, or zaman. It constitutes the existence of the outermost celestial sphere, along with time, which inheres, as it were, in that existence as a receptacle. For it, namely time, emerges only through the motion of that sphere. It also signifies the relation of the immutable to the mutable. However, the estimative faculty, wahm in Arabic, cannot truly conceive of it, since is, quote unquote, and was, quote unquote, and will be, quote unquote, past, present, and future, all in quotes, enter into whatever it may conceive of by imposing a notion of when. And again, whether in the sense of past, present, or future. The third kind of entity signifies the relation of the immutable to the immutable and is characterized by the designation of eternity, or sarmad in Arabic, which encompasses perpetuity, dahr. So these are all sort of contained within each other. So sarmad encompasses or englobes dahr. Sarmad is eternity. We're translating that as eternity. It includes perpetuity, and perpetuity englobes or encloses mere time. Perpetuity, further he writes, dahr, I already said that. Time then, he says, further on, he says, this is Ibn Sina still talking, time, zaman, is a weak mode of existence due to its being characterized by flux and change. So on the basis of this and similar passages taken mainly from Ibn Sina, it is on this basis that Mir Damād develops these three notions of temporality into ontological and relational categories in order to clarify and disambiguate the term time. So for him, the real problems that are coming about in this debate is because we're just using the word time and it's not enough. We need to disambiguate it, maybe introduce a new nomenclature, a new terminology, because there are different notions of temporality and tense that we need to distinguish and tease out before we can solve this problem. So Mīr Dāmād considers sarmad, again, which is eternity, to be a completely atemporal, metaphysical dimension or locus of utter timelessness and pure duration, unique to sheer existence, capital S, capital E, or pure being, capital P, capital B. That is to say, the sheer existence or pure being of the absolute, capital A, or if you prefer theological language, God, capital G. The fascinating Japanese scholar of Islamic philosophy, Toshihiko Izutsu, describes this dimension thus: sarmad, eternity. He describes it as an ontological domain exclusively reserved for the existence of the absolute. No other existent can exist in this dimension. Thus, all things other than the absolute, whether they be non-material or material, supersensible or sensible, are in terms of this metaphysical dimension essentially non-existent. This non-existence of all things other than pure existence, capital P, is called in Arabic Adam Sarmadi, i.e. the non-existence in the dimension of sarmad. And it is woven into the very essential nature of these things. Everything other than the absolute is in this sense preceded by non-existence. And the word precedence here has to be taken in a non-temporal sense. So much for sarmad, or eternity. As for dahr, which we have translated as perpetuity, dahr, or perpetuity, is a meta-temporal, metaphysical dimension or locus of all non-material entities. This is extremely important. You guys are all going to love this if you like Plato. This is the ontological domain of the perpetually immutable intelligences, i.e. Plato's ideal forms or archetypes, or what Ibn al-Arabi called the fixed entities, al-a'yan al-thabita. Plato's ideal forms, in case you're wondering in Arabic, is al-muthul al-aflatuniya. Or Shihabuddin Suhrawardi's lords of the species, what are called arbabul anwa', and it is also the dimension of angels. So whilst all of these entities exist in this domain, in relation to sarmad, in relation to eternity, they are non-existent. The things found in perpetuity are said to exist with time, ma'az zaman, but not in time, not fiz zaman. In the case of zaman, we're now going to the third temporal dimension. Zaman is our familiar physical temporal dimension, the world as we know and experience it, and thus we can simply translate the Arabic zaman as time. So previous philosophers and theologians who were involved with this discussion were just using zaman in this sense, or at least that was in the back of their mind, even when maybe they were trying to use it in other senses, and that's why the debate is so muddled and confused. So in zaman, in mere time, our physical temporal dimension, All things in this dimension can be said to fully exist only in terms of this dimension. In relation to sarmad or eternity, and in relation to dahr or perpetuity, they are essentially non-existent. Unlike the things found in dahr or perpetuity, the things found in zaman are said to exist in time, fi zaman, but not with time, ma zaman. So far so good, but we've only really examined how Mīr Dāmād elaborates on these three dimensions as ontological loci, peculiar to certain entities. But he also sees each of sarmad or eternity, dahr perpetuity, and zaman or time as also signifying different types of dynamic relationships. And that's important because we will understand what God's creative act is. So keep in mind again that sarmad or eternity is a completely atemporal metaphysical dimension of utter timelessness and uniquely applies only to pure being. So pure being, or al-wujud al-mahd in Arabic, in its pristine purity, or if you like, we could have said the absolute in its absoluteness, is utterly non-conditioned. The Arabic for that is al-wujud la bi sharti shay. So the absolute in its absoluteness is utterly non-conditioned, so much so that it is beyond the condition of non-conditionedness itself. It is, in the words, again, of Toshihiko Izutsu, absolutely unarticulated, undetermined, and undivided, end quote. Here, we are clearly pushing the limits of linguistic expression to the breaking point. Indeed, language begins to disintegrate in speaking of this most indeterminate of indeterminates. Yet, we are compelled to say that within, so to speak, the utterly indeterminate non-conditioned being, or, if you prefer, the divine essence in the language of theology, there are certain lines of articulation. As Izutsu puts it, it is this mutual relation between the absolute and its inner articulations that is called sarmad, or eternity. The sarmad, eternity, is not just an ontological dimension in which the absolute as pure existence exists, but also represents the dynamic relation between the absolute and its own inner determinations, which of course would be the divine attributes. So it also represents, eternity or sarmad also represents the dynamic relation between the absolute and its own inner determinations, both being immutably permanent. Needless to say, this is an absolutely non-temporal, essential relation between the eternal and the eternal. Excuse me for a moment. So much for sarmad, or eternity. What about dahr, or perpetuity? Dahr, or perpetuity, is the meta-temporal relation between the perpetually immutable intelligences and the ever-changing things of the physical world. However, even though the things of the physical world are temporal, their relation to the perpetually immutable intelligences is not a temporal relation. Rather, it is a meta-temporal, or dahri relation. In the case of zaman, or time, we have the familiar temporal relations of priority and posteriority, or if you prefer, anteriority, or before and after. Despite the fact that Mīr Dāmād is heavily indebted to Ibn Sina in deriving this tripartite scheme, he does challenge Ibn Sina's doctrine of essential contingency, or what's called huduth dhati, in which the cosmos is only preceded by a purely notional essential non-existence, rather than a real non-existence. Remember, God is only logically prior. There is no temporal gap. And so Mīr Dāmād doesn't like this. And he wants to say that his introduction of these nuances allows us to speak of a genuine non-existence, a real non-existence, what he calls Adam Sarih in Arabic, rather than a merely Avicennan notional non-existence. So, once again, in the words of Izutsu, for Mīr Dāmād, the empirical world is contingent not simply because of its existence being preceded by this kind of essential non-existence, which is posited by human reason in terms of the conceptual structure of all caused things, but because it is preceded by an entirely different kind of non-existence, real non-existence. The existence of everything in the empirical world is ontologically preceded by a real, as distinguished from an essential or merely conceptual non-existence in the dimension of time, in which it actually exists, but in that of meta-time, or dahr, the meta-temporal dimension of perpetuity. The non-existence here in question is neither essential nor temporal, but meta-temporal, or the Arabic would be dahri, or if you prefer, perpetuity, perpetual, something like that. Translation of these terms is also quite a chore. So it is in this fashion that Mīr Dāmād claims to have settled the question of al-huduth wal-qidam, the problem of the eternity or temporal origination of the cosmos, through subjecting the notions of origination and temporality to careful scrutiny. Did he succeed? Well, I'll try and help you with that. You come to your own conclusion. So by way of a basic assessment of the originality of this doctrine, let us sum up exactly what Mīr Dāmād claims to have achieved in contrast with his predecessors. By way of summing up. Mīr Dāmād does not claim that time and the cosmos both have a beginning in time, but rather that they both have a beginning with their creator. Thus, Mīr Dāmād is quite different from Al-Farabi, from Ibn Sina, and from Ibn Rushd, Averroes, Avicenna, in the sense that the cosmos and time are both finite in the direction of the past and can be said to have a beginning. It's not a temporal beginning, but it's still a beginning. Moreover, Mīr Dāmād differs from Kalam theologians like al-Ghazālī by the fact that the beginning in question is in no way a temporal beginning. To truly appreciate what Mīr Dāmād is saying here, we must be careful not to conceive of the notion of beginning as a temporal notion, but as a meta-temporal, perpetual, dahri beginning. Thus, Mīr Dāmād is not saying that the cosmos was created in time, but that time was created simultaneously with the cosmos. This simultaneity is key. When Mīr Dāmād speaks of having a beginning, he actually means having a cause. So that all that it is caused or caused, ma'lul in Arabic, even if its existence be perpetual or dahri, does have a beginning in this sense. Recall that Ibn Sina pointed out the extreme difficulty of removing tense and temporality from the estimative faculty. The latter, in the words of a contemporary researcher on Mīr Dāmād known as Kevin Brown, who he says that the estimative faculty compels the mind to believe that if the universe is really posterior to the creator, it must be temporally posterior, as the mutakallimun, the Sunni theologians, hold. In the same way, the proposition that the emanation of God cannot exist compels the mind to believe that the universe must be temporally co-eternal with God, as the philosophers hold. Mīr Dāmād is saying that neither of these positions is correct. And that is due to the distortion of the estimative faculty, the wahm in Arabic. The correct position, as he demonstrates at length in the book of Glimmering Embers, is that creation is in fact actually separate from God at the stage of cause, with an atemporal posteriority, and simultaneous with him in the stage of the effect with perpetual simultaneity. So that's what he claims to have achieved. And I think it's fascinating. It's something of a cliche to quote Whitehead's famous remark that the history of European philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. He says something to this effect. Well, that applies to other philosophical traditions, certainly to the Islamic as well. But in the case of Mīr Dāmād, I dare say we're not really in the presence of a mere footnote. And I see Mīr Dāmād, I mean, obviously you can read him as a later day Avicennan, but I think you can also take him to be a later day Muslim Platonist in as much as the Platonic ideas reassert themselves. They become very important. And I can't help but think that there might also have been some influence of Ibn al-Arabi on him, but he doesn't really quote him there to my knowledge. And so in a way we've come full circle. We're back to the cave. And we can, maybe for the first time look at the shadows and realize just exactly what they are, shadows. And, as the fire dims and we gaze at the ashes and sparks and the glimmering embers, maybe we feel we have achieved something. But there's one question that remains that I would like to address as I conclude, or by way of a conclusion, and that is the question of the tyranny of history. I would argue that Mīr Dāmād's answer to the question, does the cosmos have a beginning in time or is it eternal, must inevitably give rise to another question. And now Mīr Dāmād doesn't raise this question. I am raising this question. If the God-world relationship is to be understood as a meta-temporal, dahri relation, what does it mean for the God-man relationship, the God-human relationship? The realm of the human being is the realm of the temporal, of zaman. We are immersed in the temporal flux of events and contingencies. Each of us lives in an ephemeral present that is the product of a series of past events. A history which influences the possibilities of the future. Much of this history represents a chronology of our own choices. But these choices were all played out in a larger framework, which is rarely a matter of individual human choice. The proverbial circumstances beyond one's control. The flux of social, political, and economic events. Given this stark reality, how are we to transcend the hegemony of temporality? Can we achieve liberation from the tyranny of history? I would like to argue that we can, but only by turning to the ancients, not the moderns. When we gaze upon the traces of ancient civilizations from the remote past, such as those of ancient Egypt, or traces of the more recent traditional civilizations with a capital T, such as that of Islam, we are struck by the immutability of the essence at the heart of these civilizations. In the words of Julius Evola, those civilizations were civilizations of being. They showed their strength precisely in their identity, in their triumph over becoming, over history, change, and the amorphous flow of things. These civilizations plunged deep beyond the shifting and treacherous waters, and in the deep, they firmly rooted themselves. The opposition between modern civilizations and traditional ones may be summarized as follows. Modern civilizations devour space, whereas traditional civilizations devoured time. He continues, modern civilizations are dizzying in their fever for movement and for the conquest of space. This has led to the creation of an endless arsenal of mechanical means to reduce all distances, shorten all intervals, and contract into a sense of ubiquity, whatever is scattered across a multitude of places. This is a frenzied need for possession, a dark angst towards all that is detached, isolated, deep, or remote, an impulse to expand, circulate, associate with others, and find oneself in any which place, anywhere, except with oneself. By contrast, traditional civilizations were dizzying in their stability, in their identity, in their subsisting in an unwavering and chainless fashion in the midst of time and history. So much so that they succeeded in lending sensible, tangible expression to eternity. They stood as islands or bastions in time. Operating within them were forces that consumed time and history. For this reason, it is incorrect to say that they were. It would be more correct to say that they quite simply are. Evola does not tell us here how it is that this immutability, this liberation from the tyranny of history, is to be achieved. In all traditional civilizations, however, and the Islamic is no expression, methods of ascesis exist, which are transmitted in rites of initiation that enable one to embark on the journey of return to the origin from which all originated. Philosophers of the traditional world, like Mīr Dāmād, in their pursuit of wisdom, for that is what philosophy truly is, they all practiced such methods of ascesis and did not confine themselves to mere conceptual elaboration and dialectic. In a saying most certainly known to Mīr Dāmād, the first Shiite Imam and cousin of the Prophet Muhammad, Ali ibn Abi Talib, tells us that people are asleep. When they die, they wake up. An-nasu niyam wa idha matu intabahu. This is just an elaboration of another prophetic saying, namely, die before you die. Mutu qabl an tamutu. Mīr Dāmād and those like him saw philosophy as a preparation for death. And in its wholehearted pursuit, they achieved immortality by dying before they died. In not willing to even think of drinking from this hemlock cup, modern philosophy has truly passed away into irrelevance. Thank you.